The fourth book of Maccabees. I forget how to say that in Aramea, so bear with me. This book is like a fearful peal of thunder, echoing out of the dim horrors of ancient tyranny. It is a chapter based on the persecution by Antiochus, the tyrant of Syria, whom some called Epiphanes, the madman. Roman history of the first centuries records two such tyrants, the other Caligula, the second brilliant madman. Well, first centuries of the Common Era. The form of this writing is that of an oration. So carefully timed are the risings and fallings of the speech. So devastating are its arguments, so unfaltering is its logic, so deep is its thrusts, so cool its reasoning, that it takes its place as a sample of the sheerest eloquence. The keynote is courage. The writer begins with an impassioned statement of the philosophy of inspired reason. We like to think of this 20th century, 21st now, as the age of reason, and to contrast it with the age of myths. In the last program we talked about the mythologist. Well, myth doesn't mean something made up, per se. Myth, in the biblical use of the word myth, was like saying that one verse was saying, those cleverly imagined stories full of meaning and purpose, they're really true this time, incarnate in, so. And personal mythologization is not always something that people can do, technically. I mean, people start cults, but it's more than just finding your own meaning. But, yeah, a myth isn't dry history, so sometimes they knew it wasn't literal, but a mythology can be literally completely true. Yet a writing such as this is a challenge to such an assumption. We find a writer who probably belonged to the first century before the Christian era, stating a clear-cut philosophy of reason that is just as potent today as it was 2,000 years ago. The setting of the observations in the torture chambers is unrelenting. On our modern ears, attuned to gentler things, it strikes appallingly. The details of the successive tortures, suggesting the instruments of the Spanish Inquisition centuries later, are elaborated in a way shocking to our taste. Even the emergence of the stoical characters of the old man, the 7 brothers, and the mother does nothing to soften the ferocity with which this orator conjures courage. The ancient fathers of the Christian Church carefully preserved this book. We have it from a Syrian translation, as a work of high moral value and teaching, and it was undoubtedly familiar to many of the early Christian martyrs who were aroused to the pitch of martyrdom by reading it. Chapter 1, an outline of philosophy from ancient times concerning inspired reason. Civilization has never achieved higher thought. A discussion of the repressions, verse 48, sums up the whole philosophy of mankind, and it's kind of lost, but I kind of did something like summarizing all the philosophy, but actually no, using all the philosophy. Using 60-something different philosophers' methods, because that's what philosophy is really, to support my position mythologically. So, yeah. So this is 48 verses. Philosophical, in the highest degree, is the question I propose to discuss, namely whether the inspired reason is supreme ruler over the passions, and to the philosophy of it, I would seriously entreat your earnest attention, for not only is this subject generally necessary as a branch of knowledge, but it includes the praise of the greatest of virtues, whereby I mean self-control. That is to say, if reason is proved to control the passions adverse to temperance, gluttony, and lust, it is also clearly shown to be lord over the passions like malevolence, opposed to justice, and over these opposed to manliness, namely rage and pain and fear. Well, guilt, shame, and fear are the most basic drives of the human being, but they're not per se to be pursued for themselves. I'm recording this video in October, and you know, I do like some of the programming, but it has to be more than just some entertainment to me. It has to connect to something. But there doesn't seem to be that much this year. I mean, the least that I've ever seen in all my years. Well, I guess I don't remember the first few years or so, but yeah. But some may ask, if the reason is master of the passions, why does it not control forgetfulness and ignorance, their object being to cast ridicule? Well, we have a reward and control system of the brain. So, the answer is that reason is not master over defects inhering in the mind itself, but over the passions or moral defects that are adverse to justice and manliness and temperance and judgment, and its action in their case is not to extirpate the passions, but to enable us to resist them successfully. I could bring before you many examples drawn from various sources where reason has proved itself master over the passions, but the best instance by far that I can give is the noble conduct of those who died for the sake of virtue, Eleazar and the 7 brethren, and the mother. For these all, by their contempt of pains, yea, even unto death, prove that reason rises superior to the passions. I might enlarge here in praise of their virtues. They, the men with their mother, dying on this day, we celebrate for the love of moral beauty and goodness. But rather, I would felicitate them on the honors that they have attained. For the admiration felt for their courage and endurance, not only by the world at large, but their very executioners, made them the authors of the downfall of the tyranny under which our nation lay. They, defeating the tyrant by their endurance, so that through them was their country purified. But I shall presently take opportunity to discuss this after we have begun with the general theory, as I am in the habit of doing, and I will then proceed to their story, giving glory to the all-wise God. Now, one of the things that happened with the Maccabees is that they resorted to the same sort of tyranny that they were opposing. And same thing you could say happened after World War II. Pressing tens of millions of people, more if you look at ruling families, ever since. So, you know, it's something to watch out for. Our inquiry, then, is whether the reason is supreme master over the passions. But we must define just what the reason is and what passion is, and how many forms of the passion there are, getting rumbly in the tumbly, for one, and whether the reason is supreme over all of them. Reason I take to be the mind preferring, with clear deliberation, the life of wisdom. Wisdom I take to be the knowledge of things divine and human, and of their causes. This I take to be the culture acquired under the law, through which we learn with due reverence the things of God, and for our worldly profit the things of man. Now wisdom is manifested under the forms of judgment and justice and courage and temperance. But judgment or self-control is the one that dominates them all, for through it, in truth, reason asserts its authority over the passions. But of the passions there are two comprehensive sources, namely pleasure and pain, and either belongs essentially also to the soul as well as to the body, and with respect both to pleasure and pain. There are many cases where the passions have certain sequences. Thus, while desire goes before pleasure, satisfaction follows after, and while fear goes before pain, after pain comes sorrow. Anger again, if a man will retrace the course of his feelings, is a passion in which are blended both pleasure and pain. Under pleasure also comes that moral debasement which exhibits the widest variety of passions. It manifests itself in the soul as ostentation and covetousness and vainglory and contentiousness and backbiting, and in the body as eating of strange meat and gluttony and gormandizing in secret. Now pleasure and pain being as it were two trees growing from body and soul, many offshoots of these passions sprout up, and each man's reason as master gardener, weeding and pruning and binding up and turning on the water and directing it hither and thither, brings the thicket of dispositions and passions under domestication. For while reason is the guide of the virtues, it is master of the passions. Observe now, in the first place, the reason becomes supreme over the passions in virtue of the inhibitory action of temperance. Temperance, I take it, is the repression of the desires. But the desires, some are mental and some physical, and both kinds are clearly controlled by reason. When we are tempted towards forbidden meats, how do we come to relinquish the pleasures to be derived from them? Is it not that reason has power to repress the appetites? In my opinion, it is so. Accordingly, when we feel a desire to eat water animals and birds and beasts and meats of every description forbidden to us under the law, we abstain through the predominance of reason. Well, the reason being that they're, the belief that God forbids these things being one. And there are other ones that could follow that they would have realized by then too. Certain concentrations of nutrients or toxins, diseases, whatever, but you can't always figure that stuff out. For the propensions of our appetites are checked and inhibited by the temperate mind, and all the movements of the body obey the bridle of reason. Now what is there to be surprised at if the natural desire of the soul to enjoy the fruition of beauty is quenched? This certainly is why we praise the virtuous Joseph, because of his reason. With a mental effort, he checked the carnal impulse. For he, a young man at the age when physical desire is strong and his reason quenched, the impulse of his passions. Now, my stomach grumbling at me. I can't reason that away. And reason is proved to subdue the impulse of not only of sexual desire, but of all sorts of covetings. Well, you can't deny your sexuality, but you can't also just, whenever the urge feels whatever's available, that doesn't really work either. For the law says, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, nor anything that is thy neighbor's. Now, certainly the desire for such things spring, but then you think to yourself of consequences are outside of consequences, what's right and what's wrong. Verily, when the law orders us not to covet, it should, I think, confirm strongly the argument that the reason is capable of controlling covetous desires, even as it does the passions that militate against justice. How else can a man, naturally gormandizing and greedy and drunken, be taught to change his nature, if reason be not manifestly the master of the passions? Certainly, as soon as a man orders his life according to the law, if he is miserly, he acts contrary to his nature, and lends money to the needy without interest, and at the 7th year periods cancels the debt. And if he is parsimonious, he is overruled by law through the action of reason, and refrains from gleaning his stubbles or picking the last grapes from his vineyards. And with regard to all the rest, we can recognize that reason is in the position of master over the passions or affections. For the law ranks above affection for parents, so that a man may not, for their sakes, surrender his virtue. And it overrides love for a wife, so that if she transgresses, a man should rebuke her. And it governs love for children, so that they are naughty, a man should punish them. And it controls the claims of friendship, so that a man should reprove his friends if they do evil. And do not think it a paradoxical thing when reason, through the law, is able to overcome even hatred, so that a man refrains from cutting down the enemy's orchards, and protects the property of the enemy from the spoilers, and gathers up their goods that have been scattered. And the rule of reason is likewise proved to extend through the more aggressive passions or vices, ambition, vanity, ostentation, pride, and backbiting. For the temperate mind repels all these debased passions, even as it does anger, for it conquers even this. Yea, Moses, when he was angered against Dathan and Abiram, did not give free course to his wrath, but governed his anger by his reason. For the temperate mind is able, as I said, to win the victory over the passions, modifying some while crushing others absolutely. Why else did our wise father Jacob blame the houses of Simeon and Levi for their unreasoning slaughter of the tribe of the Shechemites? Ites is often like een or eem ending, saying, accursed be their anger. For he had not reason possessed the power to restrain their anger, he would not have spoken thus. For in the day when God created man, he implanted in him his passions and inclinations, and also at the very same time set the mind on a throne amidst the senses to be his sacred guide in all things, and to the mind he gave the law, by which if a man order himself, he shall reign over a kingdom that is temperate and just and virtuous and brave. Chapter 2, the ruling of desire and anger, the story of David's thirst, stirring chapters of ancient history, savage attempts to make the Jews eat swine, interesting references to an ancient bank. What we're forced to, there's 58 verses, and see, I can't hold the angle that gets this right. I guess maybe we can try. Well then, someone may ask, if reason is master of the passions, why is it not master of forgetfulness and ignorance? But the argument is supremely ridiculous, for reason is not shown to be master over passions or defects in itself, but over those of the body. For example, none of you is able to extirpate our natural desire, but the reason can enable him to escape being made a slave by desire. None of you is to extirpate anger from the soul, but it is possible for the reason to come to his aid against anger. None of you can extirpate a malevolent disposition, but reason can be his powerful ally against being swayed by malevolence. Reason is not the extirpate of the passions, but their antagonist. The case of the thirst of King David may serve at least to make this clearer. For when David had fought the livelong day against the Philistines. Now, Philistines is sort of a slur, so that's not really what I mean by that. Because Palash Tun is like Tiamat, so the female Satan. If you follow that, Tum. So they're calling these people wallowers of the she-demon. Now, certainly cults like that existed, but it doesn't appear that these people were what you would call Satanists. So, yeah. And by the help of our country's warriors, had slain many of them. He came at eventide, all fordone with sweat and toil, to the royal tent, around which was encamped the whole army of our ancestors. So all the host fell to their evening meal, but the king, being consumed with an intense thirst, though he had abundance of water, was unable to slake it. Instead of an irrational desire for the water that was in the possession of the enemy, with growing intensity, burned him up and unmanned and consumed him. Then, when his bodyguard murmured against the craving of the king, 2 youths, mighty warriors, ashamed that their king should lack his desire, put on all their armor, and took a water vessel and scaled the enemy's ramparts, and stealing undetected past the guards at the gate, they searched through all the enemy's camp. Now let me see. Verse 10 again. Instead, an irrational desire for the water which was in the possession of the enemy with growing intensity burned him up and unmanned and consumed him. Just to make sure if I have to go back and delete that. And they bravely found the spring and drew from it a draught for the king. But David, though still burning with the thirst, considered that such a draught, reckoned as equivalent to blood, was a grievous danger to his soul. Therefore, opposing his reason to his desire, he poured out the water as an offering to God. For the temperate mind is able to conquer the dictates of the passions, and to quench the fires of desire, and to wrestle victoriously with the pangs of our bodies, though they be exceeding strong, and by the moral beauty of goodness and reason to defy with scorn all the domination of the passions. And now the occasion calls us to set forth the story of the self-controlled reason, at a time when our fathers enjoyed great peace through the due observance of the law and were in happy case, so that Seleucus Nicanor, the king of Asia, sanctioned the tax for the temple service and recognized our polity. Precisely then, certain men, acting factiously against the general accord, involved us in many and various calamities. Onias, a man of the highest character, being then high priest and having the office for his life, a certain Simon raised a faction against him. But since, and they probably did have Greek rendered names, but he raised his faction against him. But since, despite every kind of slander, he failed to injure him on account of the people, and he fled abroad with intent to betray his country. So he came to Apollonius, the governor of Syria, and Phoenicia, and Cilicia, and being loyal to the king, I am here to inform you that in the treasuries of Jerusalem, are stored many thousands of private deposits not belonging to the temple account, and rightfully the property of King Seleucus. Apollonius, having made inquiry into the details of the matter, praised Simon for the loyal service to the king, and hastening to the court of Seleucus, disclosed to him the valuable treasure. Then, after receiving the authority to deal with the matter, he promptly marched into our country, accompanied by the accursed Simon and a very powerful army, and announced that he was there by the king's command to take possession of the private deposits in the treasury. Our people were deeply angered by this announcement and protested strongly, considering it an outrageous thing for those who had entrusted their deposits to the temple treasury to be robbed of them, and they threw all possible obstacles in his way. Apollonius, however, with threats, made his way into the temple. Then the priest in the temple and the women and the children besought God to come to the rescue of his holy place that was being violated. When Apollonius, with his armed host, marched in to seize the monies, there appeared from heaven angels riding upon horses, with lightning flashing from their arms, cast great fear and trembling upon them. And Apollonius fell down, half dead, in the court of the Gentiles. Did they mean those who turned their back on God, the Goyim? Or do they just mean people of different ancestry or nationhood? And stretched out his hands to heaven, and with tears they entreated the Hebrews that they would make intercession for him and stay the wrath of the heavenly host. For he said that he had sinned and was worthy even of death, and that if he were given his life, he would laud to all men the blessedness of the holy place. Moved by these words, Onias, the high priest, although most scrupulous in other cases, made intercession for him, lest the king Seleucus should possibly think that Apollonius had been overthrown by a human device and not by divine justice. Apollonius, accordingly, after his astonishing deliverance, departed to report to the king the things that had befallen him. But Seleucus dying, his successor on the throne was his son Antiochus Epiphanes, an overweening, terrible man, who dismissed Onias from his sacred office and made his brother Jason high priest instead. Now, Jason, the J is not a letter in any of these languages at the time, so yeah. High priest instead, the condition being that in return for the appointment, Jason should pay him 3,660 talents yearly. So, he appointed Jason high priest and made him chief ruler over the people. And he, Jason, introduced to our people a new way of life and a new constitution in utter defiance of the law, so that not only did he lay out a gymnasium on the mount of our fathers, but he actually abolished the service of the temple. Wherefore, divine justice was kindled to anger and brought Antiochus himself as an enemy against us. For when he was carrying on war with Ptolemy in Egypt, and heard that the people of Jerusalem had rejoiced exceedingly over a report of his death, he immediately marched back against them, and when he had plundered the city, made a decree denouncing the penalty of death upon any who should be seen to live after the law of our fathers. But he found all his decrees of no avail to break down the constancy of our people to the law, and he beheld all his threats and penalties utterly despised, so that even women for circumcising their sons, well, in America, it's the rate of death and stuff is a lot lower than it used to be, but we still have hundreds of people die, and the circumcision is one of the things that now some groups of Jews circumcise the females as well. It's basically the same thing. Don't let people confuse you that root castration and subincision are the same thing as circumcision, because it's not. But I'm not promoting ritual genital mutilation at all either. But anyways, botched circumcisions is one of the key reasons of the development of the whole transgender thing. Though they knew beforehand what would be their fate, were flung together with their offspring headlong from the rocks. When therefore his decrees continued to be contemned by the mass of the people, he personally tried to force by tortures each man separately to eat unclean meats, and thus abjure the Jewish religion. Now, again, if you're forced by tyrants, not, social pressure, no, threats of violence and all that other stuff, okay. They're responsible for you violating things. It's like people even try to criticize people who are coerced into sex, because it's like, well, if credible threats of violence led to that, or violence until, it's still rape. Accordingly, the tyrant, Antiochus, accompanied by his counselors, sat in judgment on a certain high place with his troops drawn up around him in full armor, and he ordered his guards to drag there every single man of the Hebrews and compel them to eat swine's flesh and things offered to idols. But if any should refuse to defile themselves with the unclean things, they were tortured and put to death. And the list isn't quite as extensive, but Islam also, there's animals that you don't eat, and you don't eat things offered up to other than God, and that includes the Tyson Corporation or whatever. But also the things that aren't slaughtered right, like carrion and that sort of stuff. And the blood that pools, whether it pools in the meat or the blood that's separate. There's the urulu papaya and some other, well, it's sort of a papaya thing, but there's plants that can help you deal with that, but, come on. Anyways, torture and put to death. And when many had been taken by force, one man first from among the company was brought before Antiochus, a Hebrew priest whose name was Eleazar, a priest by birth, trained in knowledge of the law, a man advanced in years and well known to many of the tyrant's court for his philosophy. And Antiochus, looking on him, said, "Before I allow the tortures to begin for you, O venerable man, I would give you this counsel, that you should eat of the flesh of the swine and save your life. For I respect your age and your gray hairs, although to have worn them so long a time and still to cling to the Jewish religion makes me think you know philosopher." Now, well, philosophy is not the same thing as just taking what is inherited, but that doesn't mean that you can't work out what that means to you, what you're going to do about it. And certainly people have different reasons for doing things, so however you direct them, right?